So hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'll start off by saying we had a little bit of an issue. I just noticed it as I was logging on. I know some of our marketing said 5 o'clock. Some of our marketing said 5:30. So I'm sure there are people who saw the 5:30 and are going to be joining us a half hour late. I didn't want to keep you guys waiting, so I thought we'd just get started. Of course, we'll have a recording of this available afterwards. So should be any big deal to anybody who could be missing this. We'll just send it out to them later and apologize, and we'll make sure we get it right in the future. But beyond that, thank you for joining the First Amendment Museum as we kick off our 2022-2023 online speaker series. If you're familiar with us, you know that we do a speaker series that kind of runs through the fall to the spring of, I guess, every year or so. If it's your first time joining us, the First Amendment Museum is a nonpartisan nonprofit located right up here in Augusta, Maine. I'm Max Nospish, the manager of visitor experiences at the First Amendment Museum. And as you are watching this and learning more about the museum, just know that we rely on various donations. You guys just want to make sure your mics are off before as we continue go through, just make sure audience members have their mics off. I will mute you if I have to, but I don't want to. But anyway, we rely on generous donations from people like all you guys watching and listening to continue our work. So if you enjoy this presentation, please consider supporting us. Also, check out our lineup for the 2022-2023 speaker series. This is the first one. And we got a lot of people lined up, a lot of good speakers, great selection, and they're all free and all available on Zoom. As I mentioned earlier, the recording of today's lecture will be available on our website at firstamendmentmuseum.org and on our YouTube channel. And also stick around after the presentation tonight for a Q&A with our speaker. If you have questions you would like to ask during the presentation, please put them in the chat. Or if you're watching on Facebook, please put them live on the comment section. I'll go live on Facebook right now. I should have said that earlier. But beyond that, this is our speaker tonight, Jillian C. York. Very excited to have her. I have her bio here. This is one of those speakers who I've read her book and I'm excited to have her. And so she's a native New Englander. She lives in Berlin, Germany now. She's the director of International Freedom of Expression at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the EFF. She's also the co-founder of Deep Lab, a group of artists, researchers, writers, and engineers and cultural producers that are involved in critical assessments of contemporary digital culture. She's the author of Silicon Values, The Future of Free Speech Under Surveillance Capitalism, which I am holding up right here. I recently just finished this, so I highly recommend it to anybody who wants to learn more about this topic, especially freedom of expression, freedom of speech online. We really could not have found a better speaker for tonight on this topic. You know, today's title is the title of today's talk is Offline Repression is Replicated Online, Content Moderation and Government Repression. So Jillian, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This is the first time I can't hold up a paper copy of my book because I'm actually coming to you from a conference in Zambia. It's a digital rights conference where I'm talking to people about this work and also hearing from people about this very topic. So it's really kind of special to be in both places today, both here in Zambia and with you virtually. I think I'll just start by telling you a little bit about the history of why I came to this topic and how it relates to the First Amendment, because it's not always obvious. I came to this research, came to specifically the research of internet censorship around 2008 when I was working at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard. And in that role, I was researching or assisting with research on the ways in which governments, not the US government, but other governments throughout the world, in Europe, Africa, Asia, everywhere really, I think 65 countries at that time, the ways in which those governments enacted censorship online. So around that time, what we were really looking at, what that meant technically, was the blocking of websites, or I don't know how technical people are, so I'll try to keep it top level, but the blocking of websites, the poisoning of the domain name system, things like keyword filtering, like you might have heard of from China and a few other countries, but basically technical methods to prevent citizens from accessing certain types of information. Now, of course, that information depended from one country to the next, but the snapshot that I can recall of about 2008 was that the things that most governments were interested in censoring were, of course, dissent against the government, information about religious minorities, sometimes information about women's rights and LGBTQ rights, and a range of other things, including, of course, information on how to get around internet censorship, because that would be sort of counterproductive. And around that same time, so I had lived in Morocco before that, and I write about this quite a bit in the book, and I'll get into some of the more specifics about the book in just a moment. But around that time, I'd just come from living in Morocco, and that was really where I got a lot of the foundation for the work that I was doing. A lot of the basis in international human rights frameworks were things that I gleaned from my time there, from my research there. And I had connections and friends, people who were blogging. So this was still almost, still the early days of social media when self-hosted blogs were a bit more common. And someone contacted me from Morocco and told me that he was being censored by Facebook. Now, this hadn't really occurred to me. From my perspective at that time, Facebook is a company, right? And I'm in the US. I'm thinking, okay, well, is it the government censoring Facebook? Like, what's happening here? I didn't really have a sense. And so I talked to him. I got more information from him. And what had happened was that he had started a page that was about atheism. And atheism's not particularly, or at least at the time, wasn't particularly acceptable in Morocco. Probably still isn't, but maybe things have changed. And he was not sure if it was the government or Facebook that had made this decision to take it down. I didn't know either, and I took it to the people that I worked with at the Berkman Klein Center, the professors there, and I said, what's happening here? Could it be the government? Could it be Facebook? How do we find out? And the fact was, we couldn't find out. We never really did find out, but over time I started to see this sort of pattern emerging where Facebook, and then we see YouTube and other platforms taking down content. Now, what I learned in that time was that sometimes they were doing that, of course, at the request of governments, and this is also covered in the book. Some of the early countries to pressure companies to take down speech were Turkey and Thailand, but today it's just about any country that you can imagine, including sometimes US law enforcement. But the other side of this was that these platforms were also taking down content based on their own terms of service, or what we now call the community standards. And I was still pretty young at this time, and I didn't really understand why it was that these companies had the right to do that. Okay, of course, these are private companies, but I was also thinking the impact that this could have was huge. And so I ended up writing this paper that looked at the ways in which private companies or shareholder-owned companies police speech. And that paper had a lot of resonance with people. I was surprised. I think my superiors there were surprised. But nevertheless, I was one of the first people to start documenting the process of content moderation and the ways in which these companies deal with their own rules and their own processes. Over time, this has expanded into a huge field, and I'm sure you're all aware of that now. But back then, 12 years ago, it really wasn't. And so this was, like I said, I wrote this paper in 2010, and then 2011 came around, and one of the pages that I saw taken down and kind of helped intervene in, and this is really where the book kind of starts, is the page that actually called for the protests to happen on January 25th, 2011 in Cairo, in Egypt. And that page was documenting police brutality, the death of Khalid Said, which I'm sure you've probably mostly heard that story, but again, it's, I think, in chapter 2 pretty extensively. But that page was taken down about 6 months before the protest actually happened. Not even 6 months. I think about 2 months before the protest actually happened. And I was in touch with some of the people who were behind the page. And together with some colleagues at other organizations, we actually managed to reach out to Facebook and explain to them how important, how vital this page was, that it had hundreds of thousands of followers, that this was a place where Egyptians were discussing how to push back against the government and against police brutality. And Facebook basically came back to us and said, well, This page was removed, not because of, the violence that it documents, not because of this, but because the person who's using it is not using their real name. So I think a lot of people are probably aware that Facebook has had and still has this real names policy that requires you to use your legal name, or now I think they've amended it to be some version of it. But that was cause enough to take down a very, very important page in a country that later went on to have a revolution that toppled a dictator. And so I think about that example a lot, because that's really where this idea comes in, that offline repression is replicated online, yes, of course, in the ways in which governments block websites and censor the internet in more traditional ways, but also the ways in which these companies make arbitrary rules and decisions amongst themselves, and the ways in which they respond to governments. So over time, over the past decade, I've done a lot of work on this, obviously, both in my day job and in documenting all of these stories and trying to tell these stories in this book. But really the pattern that we've seen is that I feel like I'm kind of rushing through this, so I'll try to pace myself and slow down a little bit, but I love telling this story. The pattern that we've seen is that these companies are yes, on the one hand, they're allowed to create their own rules. This is part of their rights under the First Amendment, that they also can curate their spaces as they see fit, which means either, choosing what to leave up so long as it's legal, and choosing what to take down. That's granted to them by the First Amendment. And then, of course, there's also Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, or as it's sometimes falsely called, but CDA 230. That also gives them protection from liability for those decisions that they make, even in some cases where the content is not legal. And then on the other hand, these companies are not particularly transparent about the ways in which they respond to governments. And so one of the other things that we've documented is how they respond to authoritarian demands. And so that's some of the early cases that I talk about in the book. And actually, I think this might be a great time for me to kind of jump in and just share a little piece of it with you. I had that page open. I think I've lost it. Just one moment. There we go. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to jump in with this. So this is from from the first chapter that looks at the way that Facebook was created, and I just want to talk a little bit about this because then it'll get into the next piece. So Facebook did not launch without rules. Before the release of its standards, what we know now as the community standards, there were terms of service that banned certain actions, such as bullying, intimidating, harassing any user, posting content that is hateful, threatening, pornographic, or that contains nudity or graphic and gratuitous violence, and using Facebook to do anything unlawful, misleading, malicious, or discriminatory. It also barred users, as I mentioned before, from signing up for the service with anything but their real name. While a company's TOS, terms of service, is a legal contract that outlines the terms between a company and a user of its services, the community standards or guidelines is a more human-readable document that explains a platform's rules and sometimes the consequences for violating those rules. Facebook's first community standards, launched in 2011, so that's about 5 years after the company, were clear but basic and prohibited violence and threats, self-harm, bullying and harassment, graphic content, and nudity. They further placed restrictions on copyright infringement, the promotion of regulated goods, the use of fake names or pseudonyms, and a handful of other actions. A note at the bottom of the original community standards document explained that users should report anything they see on Facebook that they believe violates the platform's terms. And like most platforms, Facebook did not, until recently, take proactive measures to identify prohibited content, instead relying upon its users to police the site through a system known as community policing or flagging. This system, argues Kate Crawford and Tarleton Gillespie, acts as a mechanism to elicit and distribute user labor. Users is a volunteer corp of regulators. I'll pause there and say, or stop reading there and say, to me, this is one of the most interesting facets of this, because we've accepted this space in which not only do we not have free expression, and that expression is not controlled by our governments, but rather by unelected Silicon Valley leaders, some of whom created, these platforms in their dorm room to rate women on, as you may recall, about the origins of Facebook, but that also they've deputized us to report each other, to be the police, to be the eyes and ears for these companies. So not only are we, as you've probably heard, we're not the, sorry, I always get this phrase wrong, but we're not the customer, right? We're handing over our data for advertising purposes, but then we're also asked to police the site ourselves. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this, and I can dig into this. It may be better in a Q&A format, but what I've spent a lot of time doing in this work is not just looking at these examples, but also why they happen. And so I get into a lot of these stories, particularly around language and automation, all of this, but I want to tell just one particular story, and I won't read it, I'll just share it with you, because I think it's really emblematic of what I'm trying to express here. So Myanmar has had an ongoing genocide for quite some time now, and around, I'm not going to look at the dates, so I may get them wrong off the top of my head, but around 2013, there was a UN investigation into that and into the role that Facebook played in it specifically. And one of the things that was found was that there were only 4 content moderators who spoke the Burmese language, who were involved in moderating speech on the platform. Another thing that was found was that some of the worst hate speech and the worst incitement to violence on the platform was coming from, not from average people, but from celebrities and from military generals in that country. And so Facebook was in this kind of strange position. On the one hand, they hadn't put enough resources into dealing with the situation there. On the other hand, it was not the average person, but government leaders. So this was long before these companies had to make decisions about whether or not Trump should have a platform. They had to make these decisions about leaders in a country that they knew very little about, where they had very little expertise, and none of which was actually in country on the ground. And I can come back to that in a moment. And I think that story is really interesting because it demonstrates the lack of resources that these companies often put in, but also the sort of rock and hard place that they're under. The other thing that we've seen there is that there's also a tendency towards what I would call over censorship, and I can explain why I still feel that this is censorship despite it not being, from the state. But there's over restriction of content in that country as well, where artists, journalists, activists, and others, just as we see in the US, have complained that their speech is regulated and removed as well, often, because a keyword is picked up on. And so I guess what I'm trying to say here, and I think what the book really encapsulates, I find it so hard to, sort of talk about it without wanting to just read it all to you or share all of the process. But one of the things there that I'm really trying to encapsulate is the fact that these companies have been put in a really awkward position, and yet they're still not doing the work that they need to do to fix that. And so I've been here, like I said, for a few days in Zambia, and I've been hearing from people from all over the African continent and from other parts of the world, hearing from people whose speech has been wrongfully removed, people who feel that machine learning technologies are misidentifying speech in their languages. I've heard from experts on localization who say that these companies are not only not putting in enough resources to moderate in certain parts of the world, but they're also getting the linguistic elements of it wrong, not paying attention to things like dialect or local cultural context. And of course, on the flip side of that, I've also heard from people who feel that misinformation, particularly around elections, is harming democracy in their countries, that hate speech is harming people's lives. And so this is truly, sort of a tricky situation and a tricky kind of conundrum. So, sorry. Oh, was that? There you go. Sorry, I thought someone said something. So that being said, the work that I do really, I find myself as sort of a historian of some of this stuff. I was there through a lot of the stories that I tell in this book, including those that took place in Egypt and Tunisia. But I also have been an advocate around this space for many years and have worked directly with companies, but also agitated against these companies for things like transparency, better user appeals, better architecture, a better business model that isn't incentivized by more clicks and more ad purchases. But that being said, I'm not sure that I have the solution either. And as I write in the book, I think that this is something that has to come from a number of different angles. And so part of the reason that I am at this event and why I go to places like this is to hear from all of these different perspectives from around the world. And part of the issue that I see is that these platforms are American. They were built in the US, they were built in Silicon Valley, but they made the decision to they made the decision to go global. They made the decision to enter all of these markets, often without much knowledge of what they were getting themselves into. And I see a question, and I'm not sure if I should jump in on that now, or if I should come back to it later.
Yeah.
Max, do you?
Do you
Yeah?
want to just let me know when you want to jump into the Q&A? I have a good question before that question that I hope will set the background for Warren's question.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to anytime. Yeah,
Sure.
absolutely.
Yeah,
I'm
we can. Yeah, we'll
better at
jump.
answering questions than I am at talking about myself. So.
We'll pick your brain. Yeah, no problem. So, one of the things that always comes up, you mentioned it a little bit, is Section 230. Can you explain that a little bit? Dumb it down for all of us, and then say why it's so controversial. And then we'll do Warren's question. I believe it's Owen
Yeah.
Hughes. Sorry, excuse me. I thought someone else was asking. Owen Hughes.
Absolutely. So Section 230 was created as part of the Communications Decency Act, which was created in 1996, signed by Bill Clinton, and then most of it was scrapped. So when I said it was falsely called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, it's because the CDA doesn't really exist anymore. But Section 230 itself has been called the 26 words that created the internet. It's seen by many, many people and free speech advocates in the US as absolutely, the most important statute for protecting free expression. But it's also in the past few years become controversial. So let me tell you what it is. And I want to get the wording exactly right on this. So I am pulling it up. So Section 230 says that no provider or user of an interactive computer service, so that usually means platforms, but also things like ISPs, shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. So in essence, like I said, this is where the confusion comes in, and we've actually seen a lot of US politicians conflate the First Amendment with Section 230. So I want to break those apart for a second and say that it's the First Amendment that gives Facebook or Twitter or me running my own website the right to kick you off. That's the First Amendment, because a company has First Amendment rights, and that company can make its own decisions about what it hosts and what it doesn't host. But Section 230 ensures that a platform is not treated as a publisher, as a speaker. So that's what makes Facebook not the New York Times. That's what gives them sort of a separate status. And so that's where that liability protection comes in, that these companies, by and large, and again, there are carve-outs to this. One of the most notable recent ones is SESTA FOSTA, the anti-sex trafficking law that's, I would argue, has actually had a very negative impact on a lot of online speech and online content, despite its good intentions. But that being said, Section 230 is what protects platforms from liability in the event that they host something. So sorry, I'm getting on a tangent. They're only held liable for illegal speech once they're notified. For the most part, I believe that child sexual abuse imagery is the one major exception to that.
So, and kind of, I wanted to ask that to lead into Owen's question here. And Owen, thank you for asking this question. Owen says he's interested to know how a social media company can claim immunity as a common carrier. Maybe if you want to, Jillian, if you want to break some of this terminology down for those who may not know. When it edits or censors its users' content, isn't it contradictory? Says from the tenor of Jillian's remarks, I guess that ship has sailed. So if you want to address that.
Yeah, so I can't speak to the common carrier language. I always forget what I'm not. A lot of my education around this doesn't actually come from the U.S. So despite the fact that I work for the EFF and all my colleagues are mostly U.S. lawyers, I'm often speaking in European terms, and that one always escapes me. But that being said, I can answer the question regardless, which is that the reason that these platforms are immune when they edit or censor content is in fact the First Amendment. That's what gives them the right to do that. So they're, just like I can have a blog and I can choose to remove your comment and I'm not held liable for that. These platforms have that same right. Whether they should or not is another question, but they do.
So I've noticed that some of a lot of the criticism about social media companies' freedom of speech policies and freedom of expression policies, a lot of those criticisms come from the right. In fact, we have a court case in Texas in which they're revisiting this whole concept of social media companies as neutral carriers and neutral arbiters of information because they're censoring right-wing beliefs. Do you think there's truth in that? And do you think there's truth in the right-wing perspective on this? Or do you think they're being unfairly silenced and maligned by these social media companies? Or do you think social media companies are implementing their free speech policies fairly?
You know, it's actually a really interesting question that I'm not sure I would even have the same answer that I would 2 years ago. So when I first started looking at this, I was coming from outside of the US, even though I was working at a US organization. A lot of my work was elsewhere. And what I was seeing taken down first, the canary in the coal mine, so to speak, was activists in Thailand who were speaking up against the king. It was people in Egypt pushing back against police brutality. Later in the US, I started to see similar things happen around 2014 with people as part of the Black Lives Matter movement having their content removed. And it was only around the time of Trump's election that I saw the right kind of change their approach to this topic. Now, I don't mean that as a blanket statement, but up until that point, when I gave talks in the US at, bipartisan events, which I often did in DC, what I would get from at least right-leaning libertarians was, well, these are private companies, they can do whatever they want. Like, they were that was generally the reaction I got from most people in the US, was to kind of shrug and say, why does this matter to me? These are companies. Now, again, they were smaller platforms back then, so obviously the impact was different. But at the same time, it was only after Trump was elected and the platforms were responding to things like Charlottesville that you started to hear the right say, we're being unfairly targeted. Now, first of all, what I would say is that right-wing speech is taken down often. So is left-wing speech. So is everything in the middle. And so are people all over the world. What I document in this book is mostly that side of the story. Obviously, there are problems with speech on these platforms too. We can argue around misinformation, around incitement, on a whole lot of other harms that exist elsewhere in the world, including things that have led to genocide. But at the same time, what I'm really interested in and what I've tried to document is again, I call it censorship. I'm taking a neutral view of the term censorship and taking it outside of its US terminology to look historically at, who censored before the state did. It was often the church or other religious institutions. And so I don't think that censorship is purely a domain of the state. And if we look at the size of these platforms, I believe that we can call this censorship, even though it's not state censorship or a First Amendment violation. And so with that said, I think what we're seeing now is some of the policies that platforms have put forward maybe do impact the right more than others, but that's because often those policies are aimed at certain types of hateful speech, or at least what the leadership of those platforms deems to be hateful. And so I can see how people on the right would often feel that they're being targeted more because they're the ones who are engaging in the type of speech that those people find hateful. That being said, I can see it on all sides. I can see wrongful takedowns on all sides, and I can see hate speech coming from various people of various backgrounds from all over the world.
And so, just because you've mentioned you've conjured up his name, and so I think he is the elephant in the room here, is Trump getting kicked off Twitter.
Yeah.
And I'll ask you point blankly, did Twitter make the right decision? And this is something I bring up too when I do virtual field trips with students all the time. Did Twitter make the right decision in terms of kicking off Donald Trump from its platform? Yes or no? Or, whatever nuanced take you want. I don't want to put you in a corner.
Yeah, I hate it, but it is, or I hate to say it, but it is going to be a nuanced one. So first of all, I'll say that if it was the right decision, they made it at the wrong time. Trump violated the rules like 2 years before they kicked him off. Maybe not exactly 2 years, but something like there was documentation of him violating the community standards multiple times before he actually lost his account. And so what I would say to that is, if I did that, I would be kicked off. Why wasn't he held to the same standards as any average individual? And I think that's a question that we need to be asking ourselves. If politicians, if elected officials should be held to the same standards as everyone else, or if they should be held to a lower standard or a higher standard. Now, it's really interesting because Nick Clegg, the former UK politician, I forget what his role was, but he was a former politician in the UK and then became one of the policy heads at Facebook. This is a direct quote from him. He said, would it be acceptable to a society at large to have a private company, in effect, become a self-appointed referee for everything that politicians say? I don't believe it would be. Now, of course, a politician would say that, right? But I think it's a really great question. Should platforms private companies, run by people who we definitely didn't elect, be able to censor elected officials? I think it's a really, really interesting and valid question that absolutely has a slippery slope. I also think that Trump is held to a different standard as other politicians. I think he was actually held to a a lower standard. There are other politicians in Europe and elsewhere in the world who have probably also violated the community standards, but because they don't get as much media attention in the US, they weren't under as much pressure to do anything about that. And so that's what troubles me about it. I'm less concerned about whether or not Trump can be on Facebook or Twitter, because frankly, he can also go on CNN. I'm more concerned about the vulnerable individual who gets kicked off of these platforms because they may not have anywhere else to speak. And that's particularly true if they live under an authoritarian regime where the press is not free either. And so that's why I'm really interested in that more than I am in whether Trump should be able to speak there or not. But yeah, I would say they definitely waited until the very last possible second to make that decision. And I do have to question that.
So I have a question here from my mom. So thank you, Mom, for asking this question and tuning in. I'm glad she asked, though, because I have a similar question. I recently saw a poll that said 75% of Americans are worried about misinformation and disinformation online. And so my mom asks, what specific recommendations would you like to see put in place to combat disinformation campaigns designed to create discord, if any?
That is a great question. So first, let me just say there's a difference between disinformation and misinformation. I think folks probably know that at this point, but disinformation is created with an intent to sow discord or to cause confusion, to cause harm. And misinformation is the kind of thing that maybe your aunt or uncle is sharing on perhaps unknowingly, not with intent, but because they really do think it's real. And so I think that this is, one thing that's really important to consider, because we don't want to necessarily stifle people's questioning their free speech when there's no intent to harm. That being said, disinformation, I don't know if anyone's seen this, but there was a report called about the disinformation dirty dozen, which were I think 12, right? Dirty dozen, 12 individuals who were the most engaged in sharing COVID disinformation, and they were all pretty wealthy people. They were all doing it for either monetary or fame purposes. And they didn't have anyone's best interests in mind. And so I am at the point where I don't really have any problems with platforms going after those big players. When they took down Alex Jones, I was not upset about it. If they wanted to take down, a doctor who is, absolutely going against scientific principles and what they're sharing, I'm not sure that I'm so concerned about that either. That said, there need to be transparent rules around that. There needs to be an ability to appeal those decisions, and there needs to be clear standards about what disinformation means. Now, I don't want to talk specifically about COVID, because I was actually thinking a lot about medical misinformation before the pandemic happened. And one of the reasons that I think this is such a difficult problem is because sometimes things that we think of as misinformation are actually, really important conversations. So I'll just say straight up, I'm a cancer survivor, and I was met with misinformation, or maybe even, no, it was misinformation, when I Googled my diagnosis. Google's search engine told me that I had 5 years to live. Turns out not true at all. I'm doing great, full remission, blah, blah, blah. But Google's search engine did that. Why? Because they're pulling information from a third party. And so what did I do? I went on to chat groups, I went on to Facebook, and I got involved in conversations to learn more, and eventually actually found my doctor through web groups. But there was a lot of misinformation in those web groups, and there was a lot of discourse and conversation and correcting. And so the reason I'm telling you this story is that what I took from that experience is that people do need to have safe places to have free inquiry, even if they're getting it wrong. We need to be able to speak to each other and correct misinformation. But I do think that one of the right answers here is to fact check, to respond with accurate information, to recognize and diagnose when these things are happening, but also to make sure that we're checking in and holding institutions accountable. We all know that some governments, including a little bit maybe the US, have gotten some things wrong about COVID and have shared information that was not necessarily accurate, including in the very beginning when it came to telling us that we shouldn't wear masks. And so I think that it's a very tricky problem, and there should be experts involved in whatever regulation of it happens. But I don't think that the right answer is to just let it all go free.
So I have some questions and comments here from Owen, which I'll read out. The First Amendment protects me from saying things I don't agree with, compelled speech. So if I run a social media platform and I disagree with what users are saying, I can exercise my First Amendment right to shut them down. They want to exercise their First Amendment right, they should go set up their own platform. Regarding your question, how to combat disinformation campaigns, great question. But how do you know if the information is dis or miss? Doesn't that emerge over time after it has been tested? How can one have a healthy public debate when there's preemptive shutting down by some authority? I think the COVID experience is very telling. Science depends on healthy debate and vigorous testing of scientific claims. So I know you may have addressed some of that already, but if you want to touch on anything, you may have not.
Yeah. So, I mean, to the first question, basically, unfortunately, yeah, that is how it is. You can exercise your First Amendment right to shut down people on your platform, and they can set up their own platform. Now, of course, this doesn't create a very equitable situation for people of the world, which is why I work with a lot of different projects that seek to hold these companies more accountable to international human rights standards, which is also, incidentally, what the Facebook Oversight Board is also doing. I'm not sure if people are aware of that, but Facebook actually put money into a trust to create an external oversight board, which is ostensibly independent from them. I was on a panel today, actually yesterday. It's a blur over here. Yesterday with one of the members of that oversight board, and they're basing their decisions and their recommendations to the company. The decisions are binding, incidentally. They're basing those on international human rights standards. So just putting that out there. But yes, that's basically kind of the situation that we're in. And so I think that it's important to hold these companies accountable rather than just letting them do that. To the second question, though, how do we know if information is dis or miss? Well, I think, yeah, sometimes it does emerge over time. And I think that COVID, that's why I chose to talk about a different example, but I think that COVID is a really tricky situation on that. Now, I think that there is blatant disinformation. I don't think we have any evidence whatsoever that, that my arm is now magnetic because I had a shot, or that I'm creating 5G waves and all of that stuff. But I think when it comes to things like the efficacy of masks, we do need to be able to talk about that freely. We also need to have experts weigh in and, come into spaces where disinformation is rife. Sorry, I always get those words wrong. And to be able to correct that. So one of the really interesting examples that I saw was Reddit. They had I think it was their COVID subreddit. Instead of censoring people and shutting down speech, they brought in doctors to volunteer and correct misinformation, and not just do it in a, you're wrong sort of way, but to really get into dialogue with people who were sharing things that were blatantly false, and to answer questions from people who had concerns about things that they'd heard that may have been, true or not. And so I think, yeah, of course it's tricky. I think a lot of things do emerge over time. And, one of the issues with platforms for me is not so much that people are exercising their speech, but that these platforms are new, that this is the first time that everyone in the world has had the ability to talk to each other. And I was thinking about something the other day that, as I don't know if people have been following Italy's elections, but it's not good. The outcome is not great. And there's, there in Europe at least, the conversation is that Italy is headed towards a fascist government. And I was thinking, wow, it's the 2020s, it's 100 years ago. And what did we have 100 years ago? The widespread emergence of radio in people's homes. And I think that, we've seen the rise of bad governments then, we might be seeing it now. And I think what's interesting, the point that I'm getting to here is that radio was new then. The internet is still pretty new to us now. And so I think over time, some of these things will settle. We'll learn better ways to speak to each other if we put in the effort and the time and the thoughtfulness into doing that, which is one of the reasons that I don't want to see censorship become the norm in all of this. I don't think that censorship has ever solved a problem, at least not by itself. There might be, there are, as we know, there are times where censorship is acceptable in the US as well. But censorship shouldn't be a tool that's wielded by itself. In the times where it's necessary, we also have to find other means of intervention as well. And so I don't want to see, public debate preemptively shut down by some authority. I do want to see I do want us to find ways that we can push those conversations into a healthier space, because right now a lot of the discourse that I see when I participate in online spaces is not healthy. I don't think that we have a particularly healthy public discourse at the moment.
So I want to kind of bring in the another current event, Russia and their misinformation and disinformation campaigns. I hear a lot about Russian misinformation, disinformation campaigns here in the United States. Why do they seem to be so effective or powerful? I mean, they're certainly not the only country that has an adversarial relationship with the United States. I don't hear a lot about Chinese misinformation, disinformation campaigns, although I'm sure they exist. I don't hear about North Korean misinformation, disinformation campaigns, even though, again, I swear they exist, but I hear a lot about Russian. So can you talk to a little bit about that and Russia and how they do this and all that stuff?
Sure. So I'll start by saying I'm no expert on Russia, but what I do know is things that I've learned from the many talks that I've gone to over the past few years about this. So I'm going to try to channel some of that energy, but please don't mistake me for an expert on Russia and anything that I'm about to say. I think that you're absolutely right. There are a number of governments that have invested time into bots, into botnets, into what I forget the term that the companies use, but it's a really helpful one. These coordinated inauthentic mass activities. I think it's something like that. So I'll just refer to it as, sort of coordinated mass activities. And that's basically when governments are paying people or using machine learning technology and bots to infiltrate conversations, to mislead, I'm sure you've all seen one on Twitter. If you're on Twitter, you've all seen somebody who, has a mysterious flag in their profile, maybe some numbers in their name, and this person doesn't really seem to be real. Obviously, there's a real person behind it, but the discourse is often that, oh yeah, it's somebody from Russia. The thing is that China pioneered a lot of this, but they pioneered it to manipulate conversations within their own borders. We don't see a lot of this coming from China to the rest of the world. There is plenty of it that happens internally, and most of it is to push people, to push back against sort of wrong opinions about the government, about society, things like that. We've seen more democratic governments, such as Israel's, engage in similar tactics. The US has engaged in coordinated, inauthentic campaigns. There was actually a story just about a week ago about one where I think they're still investigating it, but where some portion of the Department of Defense is apparently engaging in some sort of bot stuff. That's about as detailed as I can get. So why do we hear so much about Russia? Now, here's where I'm trying to channel the Russia experts. I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that Russia's been investing for a long time in media in foreign countries. So we saw it with Russia Today. They invested in a very flashy looking television channel that they launched in the United States to a lot of pushback. I think it was around 2011 or 2012. And if you've ever watched it at any length, you see that they use Americans to be their commentators. I've been invited on Russia Today a number of times. I don't think I've ever gone on, and if I did, it was early before I knew what I was doing. But they've really done that to, like, when they talk about the U.S. on this channel, they're often having Americans say negative things about their own country on a Russian TV channel. I mean, that's kind of blatant. At the same time, a lot of the people that I have worked with in Ukraine, in Georgia, in the rest of the Caucasus and the Balkans, their take on this is, that Russia's tactic is often to sow confusion and discord. And so this is, a historical tactic, but also one that's happening now. And so it makes sense that one of the tactics that they would use is to invest in propaganda, disinformation, and just general chaos online. Now, I think some of it can be overwrought sometimes. I think sometimes Russia, gets blamed when there are certainly other inauthentic mass activities going on that are funded by other governments. But the fact is that there's plenty of research that Russia has invested in an entire agency whose purpose is to do this. We don't always know exactly what they're doing, and I think that that's part of why it's so successful, because you can't necessarily point to any one thing and say, oh yeah, that was definitely them. Of course, yes, there are situations that investigators have specifically uncovered, but it seems like the tactic is broadly to hit a bunch of different, I wanted to say targets, but that's not exactly right, to come at us from a bunch of different means, and not just us, but the world as well.
I have a question here from the chat. Would you please say more about healthy public spaces for the public to use and to communicate? What are they? How would they be created? Who could or should monitor them, etc.?
Yeah, so I'm not going to claim to have all the answers on this one. So what I'm about to say is really my opinion, perhaps with a little bit of other colleagues and friends' opinions thrown in, because I'm really interested in this. So I've talked to people about this for a long time, and I think that there's a couple things. The first thing that I think is really important is the architecture of these platforms is set up for clicks, for clickbait, and for a constant scrolling. I don't know if you use any of these platforms on your phone, but it's addictive to sit there and constantly hit scroll, to constantly see new content coming in. We know that it gives us a dopamine rush. So that's part of the problem, is that we're incentivized to just keep clicking, keep churning, and next thing you know, it's 2 hours later and you're still looking at your phone. So that's part of it. And why do they do that? Because it drives more clicks on ads. It's for advertising. It's the business model. So I think that's a huge part of the problem, that the business model of these platforms, rather than you paying to use them, you're paying with your data, with your privacy. So I think that's a huge part of it. And how do we change that? Well, there's a number of different proposals out there. There's ideas around decentralized and open source and interoperable platforms. Those are terms that I probably can't explain super articulately. It's midnight over here. But nevertheless, platforms that would allow us to create smaller communities that could chat with other communities, for example. You may have heard of some of these tools, like Diaspora was one of the older ones. And now Mastodon is another really popular one. And we are seeing more development in that space, but the reason that it hasn't fully taken off, in my opinion, is that it's less attractive and sometimes it's less easy to use for the average person. Another option is platforms like Reddit that use, not Reddit itself necessarily, but the way in which they use things like upvoting and downvoting to ensure that better content rises to the top and that negative and hateful content is often pushed down to the bottom or even hidden. Those are things that I think Twitter is actually experimenting with that now. I think some users have seen that roll down into their feeds where they can upvote and downvote content. That's a really interesting model to me as well. But then I think also it's that these platforms need to be more attuned to the cultures in which they operate. Right now, if you look at the community standards on Facebook, I believe that they're only available in a handful of languages. Once again, they're quite detailed. The examples that they use are all US. So somebody from Zimbabwe yesterday gave a talk about this where her talk was called "Who's Timothy McVeigh?" Why was it called that? Well, Timothy McVeigh is the example given in the section on terrorism in Facebook's community standards. And she said, ask your average person in Zimbabwe who that is, and they don't know. Instead, in Zimbabwe, they could use an example of, I forget the name she said, but a terrorist from that country, so that people know what's being talked about. So just cultural sensitivity is another aspect of this. And then language as well. But I also think that there are different ways that these platforms, I wanted to just make sure I answer the question. How would they be created? I think this would be a great time for people who are interested in creating a new platform to look into that. There's so much money out there for startups, and we're not seeing a lot of new platforms because a lot of people, I think there's a big challenge to competing with these big companies, and yet at the same time, in the United States, Facebook.com is on the decline. It has fewer users in the US than it did a few years ago. It's still huge in other parts of the world, but people are moving on to different places, and so this is a great time to see what else could possibly emerge. And then lastly, who could or should monitor them? Well, I think that that's the tricky thing. I think that right now, the model that relies on us to monitor each other is like I said, it's a complicated one, but I think that rather than reporting each other to a company that then pays third party uh, companies to hire individuals at low wages who are poorly trained, who are forced to look at traumatic material all day long, I think that we could find ways to police each other within our own communities. And there's a lot of different models for that that have been written about and put out there. So I'll stop there, but just to say that I think that there are so many other ways that platforms could exist and in a more healthy manner.
So we have one last question here. We'll make it the last question, which is a bummer because I can think of about a million questions to ask, which gets my brain all day. But please tell us your view of a company like Cambridge Analytics. They boasted that social media now yields 35,000 points of information about every individual in the United States. Instead of expressing oneself as an individual, aren't we as users just giving away our personal freedom?
Yes, with Facebook, absolutely, fundamentally, yes. So I don't use Facebook. I think I still have a profile on there, but Facebook is one of the most extractive companies. So whereas Twitter, you can go on Twitter and you can be anonymous. You may have to give them your email address and I think maybe even a phone number now, but you don't have to show your real name. You don't have to put any pictures on there. You're not even incentivized to necessarily. Twitter's kind of a different animal than Facebook, let's say. Sure, yes, they're still taking some of your data, but most of it is actually guesswork, which is why it's not a very profitable company. If you ever go into your settings, you can see what they know about you. Twitter thinks that I'm a man in my 20s, and I like it that way. I don't know why they think that, I guess because of my speech, but great. Facebook, on the other hand, as we know from Cambridge Analytica, is incredibly extractive. It's holding all of that information about people in the United States. We know sometimes that it's not holding it so securely because, of course, we see data breaches happen all the time. And yes, I think that in addition to expressing ourselves, we are also, as users, just giving our personal freedom away. Facebook is built around this idea of the social graph that allows them to map all of us to each other. They're using facial recognition technology to help us identify people in photos, but really I think that a lot of these things are to test out new technologies on users. And of course, you've consented to that just by clicking that terms of service when you signed up, because that allows it to by clicking the terms of service when you signed up, you actually consented to any changes that occur within the terms of service, which is always mind-blowing to me that you're not forced to re-accept them. And so, yeah, I think that I try never to tell people what to do, but I think Facebook is probably a platform that it's a good time to leave. I think there are other options out there to be social online. And there are other really cool, unique platforms out there. I think one of the great examples, for niche platforms, one of the great examples that somebody brought up recently in a conversation was Ravelry, the knitting platform, which has become a really, really positive social network for people who love to knit. And they make a lot of rules about what you can talk about there. But it works for the people who want that interest. And I think, we think of the internet sometimes as just these big three, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, but there are so many other spaces online to explore and to engage in, and where we can express ourselves without handing over so much of our data.
Yeah, so thank you guys so much. I know it's getting late over in Zimbabwe. It's only 6 o'clock here in Maine, but there's so much more we could have talked about. I mean, this book touches, again, this is the book, if anybody's wondering, Jillian is the author of this book right here. I highly recommend it. She touches on so much more in the book. She talks about Gamergate and 4chan, which is something I wish we had time to discuss and talk about because it's a fascinating little area of the internet and a piece of internet history. I highly recommend the book. Jillian, any last thoughts, any last words, anything you want to get out there before we say goodnight?
Um, oh, put me on the spot. Yeah, let me see. Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, I wish that I could just throw a copy at every one of you like Oprah and say, you get a copy, you get a copy. But I'm really proud of this book. It looks at a lot of my own personal history, but it also looks at some really interesting stories that have happened over the past decade. And I didn't get into these topics, but some of the things that I talk about in here are the ways in which vulnerable users, including, people who are engaged in sex work, including people who are doing things like documenting war crimes in Syria, the ways in which these platforms have affected their lives. And so I think it kind of, it takes an interesting journey through a number of different subjects, and I hope you enjoy it.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. We appreciate having you guys all here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jillian, before you go, I'm going to give you a free book idea. Take it.
Yeah, do it.
Next book needs to be about dating apps and the like effect they're having on society, and like how the algorithm games, like people who get more swipes get bumped up in the algorithm, and so people who never get right swipes like on Tinder get like they never get shown, and it like causes all these people to be like uber depressed and think like the world's awful. And um you should just do a book about the effects of like dating apps on like the modern mind and how it's affecting like interpersonal relationships. And the
Has nobody
conspiracy,
written that?
I have no idea, maybe. So,
I'm
I'll pass it off to you because you're smarter than me to write this. But and then the conspiracy that dating apps have been trying to big dating apps have been trying to discourage people from meeting in person, so everyone's forced onto the apps to meet each other. It's a conspiracy theory. It's an interesting one. Just
Ooh.
saying.
Oh, that's so interesting because I could even like intersperse interviews with all the people I know
People
who've done
who have
dating apps.
survived dating apps.
All right, I like this free idea.
Yeah, so just free idea. Free idea.
Very
All right,
cool.
Jillian, thank you so much. Have a good night. It was good talking to you.
Yeah, thanks. You too.